Al profesional español es hablar por teléfono en inglés. Por eso Vaughan ha desarrollado las clases telefónicas, en las que trabajarás tanto tu comprensión auditiva como tu fluidez oral con un auténtico crack de la enseñanza. Tú eliges la hora y la temática de cada clase. Flexibilidad absoluta. Calidad Vaughan 100%. Contrata las clases telefónicas de inglés de Vaughan para tu empresa. Llama al 911335831 o entra en grupovaughan.com.
¿Quieres apuntarte a un curso de inglés y no sabes cuál escoger? ¿Por qué no pruebas nuestro curso trimestral de Vaughan? Son solo 3 meses, no pierdes nada y te aseguramos que vas a ganar mucho. 3 meses en los que podrás ver cuál es tu nivel real de inglés. 3 meses en los que trabajarás tu listening y speaking en todo momento. 3 meses en los que subirás ese nivel tanto que querrás otros 3 meses y otros 3. Entra en grupovaughan.com e infórmate. Curso trimestral de Vaughan. Si tienes alguna duda o necesitas información sobre cualquiera de nuestros cursos, llámanos al 91 133 5833. Repito, 91 133 5833.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Western Civilization. From Mesopotamia to Silicon Valley. I'm your host. My name is Guy Williams, and on this program, and you are listening to Vaughn Radio. Now, on this program, I'm going to talk about the ancient Greeks. This is a subject that I just love to talk about, and every time I go back to speaking about it, I become enthusiastic. It really inspires me, and I do want to go back to the beginning. Later on, I'm going to be speaking about my favorite, the father of history. I'm going to be speaking about Herodotus and the stories of Herodotus. And, well, now I finally have the time and energy to abordar, actually in English, aplacar, as if this were sports, to tackle. To tackle Herodotus and to really speak about him. And this makes me happy. It makes me euphoric. I haven't had this much free time in a long time, so I can do it right. Now, let's begin way back at the beginning. Let's talk about the earliest manifestations of ancient Greek culture that we know. Let's talk about Minoan civilization. We don't call, it wasn't really Minoan civilization. It was called this because Sir Arthur Evans, right back at the, end of the 19th century, he decided to call it Minoan. He was the excavator of Knossos. He was the celebrated archaeologist, and he decided that Crete was going to be the home of everything. Crete was not inhabited by Greeks at that time. And so King Minos, this is a Greek legend, right? The Minotaur and all of the labyrinth, Ariadne, Theseus, all of that. These are Greek legends, and much, much later. But Sir Arthur Evans got it into his mind to call this civilization, this pre-Greek civilization, to call it Minoan. Well, from about 2100 to about 1700 BC, that's 2100 to 1700 BC, meaning before Christ, or before the Common Era, that's what we like to call it now. Modern museums don't want to make their reference specifically Christian, so they say before the Common Era. Now, at that time, the Minoans developed these palaces. And there are prototypes for the Minoan palaces in the Middle East. There are Middle Eastern, Near Eastern models from the Anatolian Peninsula. It's pretty obvious that the Minoans came from somewhere on the Anatolian Peninsula. And the ones in Phaistos and Knossos are especially beautiful, notable. Now, they weren't able to get copper. They weren't able to get tin. No, estaño. Not copper, cobre, not tin. That must have been very, very difficult because they were living in the Bronze Age, and bronze, as we know, is an alloy of copper and tin. So Crete, not having any mineral deposits of either of those, they had to naturally engage in commerce to get them. There is evidence of Minoan contact, Minoan enclaves, Minoan colonies all along the coast of Asia. Who knows? Even back then, even in the Bronze Age, the Mediterranean was something understood. You sailed from one part to the other part. There must have been great contact from east to west. But there's so little proof, and it's so tantalizing to believe that, for example, in the Iberian Peninsula at the time, that ancient Tartessos, this civilization about which we know so little, and which appears in the Bible as Tarsis and appears in legends like the legend of Hercules, but which seems to have disappeared at one point or another, or maybe conquered by the Phoenicians, or maybe by a natural catastrophe. But people have been looking for Tartessos, and we don't know. We just don't know whether we found it. Ancient Tartessos, or the Argar culture in Murcia, in Almeria, right? Near what in the future would be Cartagena, Lorca, around there. These Bronze Age peoples, well, traditionally it was always assumed that culture came from the east to the west, that the west were the barbarians, and the east had these great civilizations. And of course, it's logical to think like that if you talk about the ancient world maybe in Roman times. When the Romans were starting to become big, right, in the rise of the Roman Empire, they had all sorts of civilizations to their east, but not to their west. To their west, it was sort of wild and barbaric, less civilized than they were. And since that time, we've had this notion that ex Orient lux, right? That from the Orient you get light, or ex Orient scientia, right? From the East you get knowledge, understanding, science. But it could have worked the other way around. I mean, there is evidence that building techniques that were common on the Iberian Peninsula were found later in Greece. Other things, there may have been some kind of proto-alphabet, some way of writing things down on the Iberian Peninsula thousands and thousands of years before writing was begun in a big way in the Nile River Valley or Mesopotamia, in the Fertile Crescent. There is some evidence to suggest this. So yes, an exchange, an interchange between east and west was very, very possible at this time. But in terms of Minoan civilization, all we know is that they were travelers and that they did, out of necessity. They needed contacts all over the place. Copper, tin. Remember that tin was very, very hard to get. And the best places to get tin were outside the gates of Hercules, outside the Mediterranean, out into the Atlantic. And yes, tin was very, very valuable, worth far more than its weight in gold at that time, to serve as an alloy with copper. Copper was relatively common, and there were deposits of copper pretty much everywhere. The island of Cyprus, Chipre, actually means copper, because originally that was a very, very productive source of copper in the ancient world, famous for its copper. The island itself, Chipre, Cyprus, where Aphrodite was born, allegedly, that is because of copper. Now, these palaces, these strange buildings at Knossos and Phaistos on the island of Crete. No walls, which is just the strangest thing for the ancient world. Why? Does this mean that Minoan civilization was so powerful, that their navies were so strong, that they could resist pirates? Or that they were so peaceful? Or what does that indicate? In any case, these palaces, again, administrative and ceremonial, and, well, the outbuildings, right, the dependencias of these palaces were massive and very intricate. This is what gave Arthur Evans the original idea that this must be where King Minos lived. This must be the home of the Minotaur, because these palace complexes were absolutely labyrinthine, like the labyrinth. Remember that in English, el laberinto is one thing. El laberinto, no, but un laberinto. The normal word we use for that is maze. M-A-Z-E, maze. So, I feel like I am trapped in a maze. And this, of course, is where we get the word amazing. So yes, algo asombroso is amazing. Pero no, porque estás en un laberinto. Estoy asombrado. I am amazed. Estoy metido en un laberinto. Literally. That's what it means. So yes, the maze of passageways, hallways, the maze of rooms and small rooms all around these palaces, these mansions, storing grain and barley, grains like barley, olive oil, wine, naturally the Mediterranean, the big Mediterranean staple crops, saffron, azafrán, no, coriander, and, well, all sorts of things. Coriander would be comino. We can say cumin or coriander. Knossos, it has been calculated that Knossos had a population of about 15,000 people, which at that time was highly, highly significant. Now, in the year 16,000, more or less, 16,000 BC, 16,000, I'm saying 1600, excuse me, 1600. In the year 1600, 1600 BC, there was a volcanic explosion in or around what is today Santorini in Greece, that popular tourist destination. Now, that would have been the island of Thera. It exploded in a massive eruption, and this could not have left the civilization then without an impact. I mean, there must have been a severe impact because of that explosion. Nothing else is conceivable. A major change came to Minoan power around 1450 BC. And this is when people from the mainland, people from Greece itself, began to attack Crete. And so these people who had lived previously without walls, without defenses, without any need for walls or defenses, all of a sudden, they had to learn the art of war. And it wasn't good enough. Because little by little, these Greeks, the ones we call Mycenaeans, they began to take over, and the Minoans, well, they began to disappear. By the way, Mycenaean doesn't mean anything more than Minoan does. It's just a modern name. They didn't call themselves that. Mycenaean just means Bronze Age Greeks. Mycenae is a city. It's a palace site on the Greek mainland. The graves, the tombs in Mycenae are absolutely splendid, so it must have been a very, opulent place in its day. But we don't know anything about these people, so yeah, we just call them Mycenaeans. We don't know where they came from originally, and presumably from Mycenae or other cities comparable to Mycenae. In any case, as the Mycenaeans began to take over, many of the Minoan palace sites were destroyed or abandoned. When the Mycenaeans moved to Crete, they took over more than just the island. They took over the writing. There's a script there, a kind of writing that was called Linear A. And the Mycenaeans adapted it to themselves, to their own language, which was an Indo-European language, like ours. It was the proto-ancient Greek, right? It was Greek before Greek. And this new script, Linear B, they call it that, Linear B has been investigated, and more or less because we kind of know what the future of that language is. We know what to look for in Linear B. We don't know what to look for in Linear A. We know what to look for in Linear B, and so it has been more or less deciphered. Still, the Palace of Knossos destroyed, and the Mycenaeans were probably responsible. Now, around the year 1200 BC, this culture as well was beginning to collapse. Many cultures were beginning to collapse in the Greek world, the Hittite world, the Egyptian world, There were all sorts of invaders, sites being destroyed, abandoned. The reasons, people have been wondering about this. People have been looking for the driver, for the motivator, for the trigger, no, el gatillo, the thing that, the impulse that sent all of these different people traveling and raiding, and, was it some kind of invasion? Was it, some kind of devastation, a natural, was it, hunger, famine? We really don't know. At first, people thought that, presumably it could be the creation of iron, because iron was so much more potent, so much more resistant, so much more powerful, unstoppable. When iron came out, there was nothing. If you had iron and your neighbors did not, there was nothing to prevent you. There was nothing to stop you from attacking and simply destroying them. And so the disruptive technology represented in iron would be one potential source for all of this movement of peoples, but evidently the chronology doesn't work out. Evidently it's not all there. It doesn't add up. One of my teachers described it to me once. She's done archaeological work herself, and she says that you can look through the archaeological levels, the different strata of a city, and you think you know what's happening. You watch this and that being introduced, you watch a change, and then another change, and then all of a sudden, it stops. And something completely different. She says, it's like watching television. You're watching television, and you think you understand what you're seeing, and then all of a sudden the television screen goes blank. Then you're watching something else. And you have no idea whether it is the continuation of the program or whether you have changed the channel. Because what you're watching has literally nothing to do with what you were watching before. Something has happened, something big, but you don't know what to attribute it to. And the archaeologists don't even really agree on a timeline for all of this. There are some people that think that the Dark Ages, because this is what they're going to be called, the Dark Ages lasted for many, many centuries. Others say that no, we're completely mistaken in this. The Dark Ages did not last very long at all. And so, again, it's very, very difficult to find a consensus. Again, what we do know is that the island of Thera, Santorini, just south of Crete, blew up in around the year 1600 BC. The explosion is supposed to have been one of the greatest ever recorded. You can imagine blowing up things into the air that, we have never seen in our lifetimes. That certainly had not been seen in the 19th, 20th. Well, in the 19th century, there was the volcanic eruption of Krakatoa, which turned the sunsets into splendid things, bright red sunsets. Everybody said that the world was sweeter then and a little colder for 3 or 4 years after the Krakatoa explosion in 1883. But, well, for example, in the 6th century, the middle of the 6th century, just before the Justinian plague wiped out it meant the end of the ancient world, the end of Byzantine domination. Just before this, there were 2 or 3 years where all over the world there was snow during the summertime, a time without summer, a time without crops, a time without harvest. And people starved, people died, and afterwards, years of plague, terrible plagues. Well, all of that attributed now, at least, to a volcanic eruption in Iceland. This particular volcanic eruption, the one of Tira, put about 24 cubic miles, let's call it 40 cubic kilometers of material into the air. And so it must have been really, really devastating, just all across the world. Now, on Santorini today, a place called Akrotiri was a Bronze Age city buried like Pompeii, buried like Herculaneum in the explosion, which has been excavated since 1967. And they have discovered fascinating things. I'll be talking about that after the break.
Si los profesionales de su empresa no comunican eficazmente en inglés, su empresa no necesita clases de inglés. Su empresa necesita una solución y la necesita urgentemente. Muchas son las empresas españolas que despilfarran el dinero contratando clases de inglés a diestro y siniestro. Café para todos y resultados para nadie. Dominar el inglés requiere enfoque, esfuerzo y un plan. En Vaughan Empresas tenemos un plan hecho a medida para su empresa. No nos interesa vender clases, nos interesa conseguir soluciones. Y para ello tenemos un apasionado equipo de profesores formados meticulosamente en el método Vaughan. Llama al 911335831. 911335831. Su empresa necesita una solución y la necesita urgentemente.
Hey, have you heard about our trimestrales? No? Well, let me tell you all about them. The program lasts 3 months. Eso es, dura 3 meses. Many different timetables to choose from. From Monday to Friday, Saturdays in the morning. And you'll have plenty of homework. And your teacher will correct your homework and check it to make sure you're making progress. Find out more now. Our trimestrales at Vaughan. Small groups, only 4 to 6 students per class, and the class is focused on speaking and using the language. Contact us and find out about trimestrales with one of our dynamic Vaughan teachers. You won't regret it. No te arrepentirás. More information at grupovaughan.com.
Sin prisa pero sin pausa. This is the Spanish expression that I use when people ask me what they should do with their children concerning English. Sin prisa pero sin pausa. The target date for English mastery is age 23. Children and adolescents don't need English, really, until they reach adulthood, until they finish their studies and start looking for their first job. This is usually at the age of 23. If they don't know English well at this point, they are in trouble. They have a problem, an important problem. If they don't know English well at the age of 23, when they enter the labor market, they will probably never reach a decent level, a good working level of English. So, as a mother or father, you need to make sure that your children gain a good command of English by the age of 23 at the latest. This means that when the child is born, you have 23 years to solve the problem. Are you capable of solving a problem if you have a 23-year window to solve it? I hope so. Here in Vaughan Systems, we provide children, with dynamic verbal access to English starting at the age of 4. We expose the children to the native sound of the language, and we work especially hard to promote effective listening comprehension and to make the language fun and attractive for the children. Entrust your children to us, little by little, slowly but surely, sin prisa pero sin pausa. We will transform them into bilingual adolescents and prepare them for age 23. Contact Vaughan Jr.
Más información sobre la línea Junior de Vaughan Systems en el teléfono 91 133 5832. 91 133 5832.
Si tienes alguna duda o necesitas información sobre cualquiera de nuestros cursos, llámanos al 91 133 5833. Repito, 91 133 5833.
El máster en inglés profesional te ofrece este programa.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is Western Civilization, from Mesopotamia to Silicon Valley. I'm your host. My name is Guy Williams, and you are listening to Vaughan Radio. Now, on the first part of the program, I was talking about the ancient Greeks and the beginning of the ancient Greeks. Greece, before the Greeks arrived. Minoan civilization. These Minoans living on the island of Crete were not Greek, but there was, well, the beginning is normally dated from that. The Mycenaeans, who began to take over, were most definitely Greek, but there may have been some kind of cultural fusion there. There may have been some kind of borrowing. I spoke about the Linear A script, which the Mycenaeans adapted. Linear B was a syllabic written language, and it was applied to administration, technical things like taxation, and yet Linear B, containing 40 characters. This is before the Phoenicians gave their alphabet to the rest of the world. So before phonetics, before the before individual letters in alphabets. Well, this Linear B, containing 40 characters, had the distinct Greek. Well, there are names for many of the Greek gods that are going to be there later. There are very clear grammatical rules and just a sort of clarity of thought in general, which is going to characterize the later Greeks. The Mycenaean tablets contain the names of, as I say, the gods and the Mycenaean religion. In this case, much more patriarchal than the Minoan religion. One thing that characterized the Minoans was a matriarchy. You do see women priestesses, goddesses. It's extraordinarily common there. You can see them holding snakes, right? Serpents, which in the ancient world universally was the symbol of immortality, because everybody knows, el serpiente se despoja de la piel, no? The serpent sort of sloughs off the la muda, no? Right? The snake sheds his skin and is renewed, reborn, resurrected. And so the serpent becomes the symbol of rebirth, of health. Naturally, when you go to a pharmacy today, there are signs of the serpent. This is why. Well, you do see these priestesses holding snakes, which talks about a mother goddess, the Minoan Zeus, the father god, Zeus the father, Zeus, Theos Pater in Latin. That's where we get the word Jupiter. So yes, and Theos and Dios are pretty much the same word. So all of that from an Indo-European language family. Theology from Zeus. Well, the Minoan Zeus was subordinate to his mother. And the Minoan Zeus was not, in fact, immortal. There was a tomb of Zeus on Crete, which, of course, later Greeks were absolutely horrified by the idea that Zeus might be mortal or might be subordinate to a woman, any woman, because the Greeks were, in fact, a very patriarchal society. Now, the Mycenaean cities, Pylos, Tiryns, Mycenae itself, they were fortified with these incredible walls, which later Greeks believed could only have been built by the Cyclops. Remember the Cyclops from the Odyssey, the island of the Cyclops, those one-eyed giants. So these walls are called Cyclopean walls, as they are in Spain or in Spanish or many other language, right? These walls, these big walls to surround the cities, made from massive stones and built before memory, before people began to record things in writing. These are called Cyclopean. Now, every city had a source of water, and that source would be a spring, manantial, connected usually by tunnels. And this would allow a city to be able to resist being surrounded and put under siege. These palaces, at least the Mycenaean palaces, were organized around a large hall containing a place of burning, un horno, a hearth, a fireplace, surrounded by 4 columns. And yes, this is the way the Mycenaean kings, the palaces, the burial grounds, the tombs, well, it was an extremely, again, very, very similar to the way that subsequent Greeks were living. It was logical for the first people to excavate there. People like Schliemann, to think that he was actually digging up in the times of the ancient, for example, Agamemnon, the times of the Trojan War, because that of course was his obsession. Heinrich Schliemann was absolutely obsessed and believed that these must have come from Homeric times, when in fact they came from much, much earlier. They came from, again, before the Dark Ages. Now, you have to contrast that with the town I was talking about just a little earlier, the Minoan town on Santorini, called Akrotiri. It was from the Bronze Age and, as I mentioned, had been buried. It has been under excavation since 1967. Now, in addition to all of the storerooms, all of the workrooms, all of the business, right? Because you can see how they can farm, how they can fish, how they can work with ceramics and wood, how they weave textiles. You get evidence of contact with Lebanon, with Egypt. Again, the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the extensive trade networks from all over the Eastern Mediterranean. These people lived in relative luxury. Certainly they were comfortable. What really stands out is how much they enjoyed life because of the frescoes that they paint, landscapes, exotic landscapes. They really, really like looking at special places. They have monkeys, leopards, antelopes, and all sorts of representations as well. Well, dolphins, one of their favorite animals, dolphins on the wall. And yes, absolutely incredible to see what they were doing at Akrotiri. The contrast with the much more, as I say, patriarchal and sort of warrior-like Mycenae is very, very striking, no? Muy llamativo. Now, the excavation undertaken by Sir Arthur Evans, he was in charge of the museum at Oxford University, the Ashmolean Museum at the time. And at one point, people started digging up coins that must have been used around then near Heraklion, and he decided to investigate himself. It was the year 1900 when he bought the location, convinced that there was something big there, that it could be this palace of King Minos. In any case, this is where he discovered Linear B, Linear A and Linear B, the writing on clay tablets, about 2,000 different clay tablets, bunched together, all datable to about 1,400 BC, and Linear B, datable from about 1,200 BC. All of that, and then Linear A still waiting to be decoded, still waiting to be understood by us. We still don't know what they were talking about. Interesting that that there still is a mystery like this waiting to be solved. I remember it wasn't so long ago that the hieroglyphs, the Mayan hieroglyphs, still had not been deciphered, and we didn't know what they lived like, what they thought. So yes, this is going to be, perhaps in our time, this will be the next great step forward. Now, in Crete, in addition to their love of life and their appreciation for, as I say, for the exotic animals, exotic landscapes, fruit and vegetables from all over the place, you have depictions of, well, a man holding a bull's horns, and when the bull moves its head, the horns act like levers, right? Para apalancar, no? To make the man dive head first over the horns and use his hands to go off the bull's back. So this kind of gymnastics event that must have been very, very incredible to see. I mean, it must have required the skill of an acrobat. You must have had agility in these people. Another thing that you see is that many of the people painted on these frescoes in walls in places like Akrotiri are very sort of espigados, no? They're very sort of lithe. They're very lanky, slim, esbeltos. And they look agile. They look healthy. They are obviously idealized, but this isn't an attempt to give us the portrait of a rich and powerful person. No, it's the attempt to give us a reflection of what people can be in a more idealized state, right? Aesthetically. So yes, this, you can see, this is what they appreciated. But as I mentioned earlier in the program, Minoan civilization had to succumb to Mycenaean civilization, and in turn, Mycenaean civilization, we are talking about Proto-Greeks now, authentic Greeks. The Mycenaean civilization had to succumb, in turn, to others coming from the north. It's clear that the Mycenaean cities were destroyed by people using a different kind of weapon. The Mycenaeans used chariots, right? Fighting chariots drawn by horses, right? Carrozas, so that you would have one or two people on them. You would need to fight on a flat surface so that the horses and the wheels could function. And the charioteers used the bow and arrow. This was their way of fighting. Evidently, their enemies, the ones who defeated them, used javelins, right, long swords, and long spears. So, swords and spears against chariots and bows. They destroyed the centers of Mycenaean civilization. They sacked the Mycenaean cities. And there's the idea that these were also Greeks. Let's call them more primitive Greeks, different kinds. They perhaps spoke a dialect of Greek called Aeolic, and there is an idea that these people may have come south and begun to work with the more civilized Mycenaeans as mercenaries. And at one point, perhaps they rose up against their masters. in any case, these northern Greeks, the northern Greeks spoke Ionian, right? Jonian, el griego jónico, right? The Ionian Greek. The Mycenaean Greek was Ionian, and the northern dialect was called Aeolic. Now, this was going to cause a displacement. Now, the Ionians were going to spread out around the Aegean Sea. And when we normally talk about Ionia and the Ionian cities, we mean Greek enclaves in what is today Turkey, today the Anatolian Peninsula. So yes, the destruction of the Mycenaean centers led to a collapse of civilization. And I mentioned earlier there is no real consensus for what caused this collapse of civilization initially, or why, if there is a why, and how long it lasted. People really don't know. Our ignorance is still, on this point, still very strong. But of course, it didn't just affect the Greeks. It was widespread. Some of these people arriving, for example, in biblical lands, you have the story of David and Goliath. Well, you remember that Goliath, the giant, was a Philistine, and these people, these Philistines, they were also newcomers. They also arrived, the 6 different Philistine cities, all the way Ashdod, Ashkelon, all the way down to Gaza. These Philistine cities were established by people who had themselves been displaced, who spoke an Indo-European language, who had been displaced in the times of these invasions, these dark ages. So, many Mycenaeans from the destroyed cities ran away to the island of Cyprus, to the mountains of Arcadia, and to the Aegean Islands in Asia Minor. The Dorians, a collection of primitive, Greek speakers from northern Greece, less civilized than the Mycenaeans, the Dorians began to move in, emigrated into southern Greece in the, say, 12th or 11th century. And these are the ones who, when we normally talk about Greek civilization and the Greek myths and so forth, often we are speaking about the Dorians. Now, unfortunately, Sir Arthur Evans took a step too far. He hired a restorer called Émile Giron, from Switzerland. This man, Émile, and his son began to restore fragments, and the fact is that they began to just confirm their prejudices and some of the things that I've been talking about the love of the exotic landscapes, the love of life, all of that, especially in Knossos. Maybe some of that is invented. And where it became popular and where people started to pay good money for these antiquities coming from Minos, it was, Minoan culture from Crete. Maybe half the population, I don't know. They started faking. They started falsifying these antiques. They started forging antiques. And sumptuous antiques we're talking about with ivory and with gold. And at that time, because there were no criteria for judging, you just didn't know. And some of these people were very knowledgeable about what they were doing. It reminds me, again, El Relojero de Yecla in Spain. El Relojero de Yecla and how he would read in the archaeological journals, in the scientific journals, different theories about the origin of the Iberos, and he would make, a statue of one idol or one priest, or, with a little of this, with a little Egyptian in it, or a little Phoenician in it, just to justify the prejudices of one archaeologist or another. And in this, archaeology itself suffers. The Cerro de los Santos, I mean, there were clear falsifications in the Archaeological Museum in Madrid, el Museo Nacional de Arqueología, until relatively recently. And people knew it. It's just that nobody, they'd been there so long, and nobody wanted to admit the mistake. All right, I've run out of time. Thank you for listening, and please listen to my next program.